January. Winter has closed its fist around occupied Europe. The air is sharp enough to burn the lungs. Snow lies undisturbed along a narrow rail line cutting through dark forest, the steel tracks humming faintly in the cold. Somewhere beyond the trees, an industrial city breathes smoke into the night, its factories working for a war that shows no mercy. A lone figure moves carefully along the embankment. His boots sink into frozen gravel. Each step is measured. There is no patrol in sight. No voices. Only the distant creak of metal and the soft ticking of a watch pressed close to a gloved wrist. He is not supposed to be here. The message was clear. The order explicit. Stand down. Wait. Do nothing. Yet the satchel at his side carries explosives prepared days earlier. The fuses have already been cut to length. The calculations finished. The decision made long before this moment. If he walks away now, the network survives. If he acts, the consequences will spread far beyond this stretch of track. He kneels beside the rail, hands steady despite the cold, knowing that once this charge is set, history will not care whether he was told to stop. And to understand how one man came to ignore his orders, the war that shaped his choice must first be understood. By the winter of 1942, Europe was no longer a continent at war. It was a continent under strain. From the Atlantic coast to the outskirts of Moscow, the German Reich had stretched itself across thousands of kilometers of occupied territory. Rail lines, factories, ports, and power stations formed the arteries of that empire. They moved coal, steel, ammunition, fuel, and men. Without them, the war machine stalled. This was not theory. It was logistics. Every German division on the Eastern Front depended on trains leaving the Ruhr, Saxony, and Silesia. Every tank required fuel refined hundreds of miles away. Every artillery shell fired at Stalingrad or Leningrad began its journey on tracks like the one cutting through the frozen forest tonight. By late 1942, those tracks were under constant pressure. The invasion of the Soviet Union had shattered German assumptions about speed and control. The war in the East had become a grinding contest of supply and endurance, while in the West, Britain and the United States were preparing their return to the continent. This reality did not go unnoticed in London. The British government had learned early that direct confrontation inside occupied Europe was impossible. Conventional armies could not yet land. Air raids alone could not paralyze German production. But there was another way, one that required no divisions, no armored columns, and no flags. Sabotage. In July 1940, Britain had quietly formed the Special Operations Executive. Its mandate was blunt and dangerous, set Europe ablaze. The organization trained civilians and soldiers alike in demolition, wireless communication, and clandestine movement. They were taught how to destroy rail switches, derail trains, cripple factories, and vanish before dawn. But the SOE was cautious by necessity. Every act of sabotage risked reprisals. German occupation policy was ruthless and methodical. For every rail line destroyed, villages could be fined, hostages taken, or civilians executed. Commanders in London weighed every operation against the cost paid by those who would never see the results. By 1942, that balance had become increasingly fragile. The German response to resistance activity had hardened. Entire regions in France, Norway, the Netherlands, and Eastern Europe were placed under collective punishment. Rail guards were doubled. Security battalions, often drawn from rear area troops or collaborationist units, were stationed along key infrastructure. And yet, sabotage continued. Resistance networks across occupied Europe were growing more capable and more impatient. Men and women who lived under occupation saw the trains every day. They heard the factory sirens. They watched troop convoys pass through their towns on their way to distant fronts. For them, the war was not abstract. It moved past their doors on steel wheels. By the winter months, rail sabotage had become one of the most effective tools available to the Allies. A single damaged line could delay divisions for days. A single derailment could force entire supply schedules to be rewritten. German reports from the period increasingly emphasized rail security as a priority equal to frontline needs. But success bred caution. As operations expanded, Allied planners began to fear something else. Not failure, but uncontrolled action. Sabotage carried out at the wrong time, in the wrong place, or without coordination could disrupt larger strategic plans. Worse, it could provoke reprisals that destroyed entire resistance cells overnight. Orders, therefore, became more restrictive. Targets were selected carefully. Timing was controlled from afar. And in many cases, agents were instructed to wait, sometimes for weeks, while intelligence was verified and political calculations were made. For the man kneeling beside the rail, those calculations had already been made elsewhere. But on the ground, in the cold and silence of occupied territory, the war looked very different. And to understand why he chose to act alone, the man himself and the orders he received must now come into focus. Encoded in short, clipped transmissions, sent at irregular intervals, broken by silence that could last days. They were designed to be memorized, not written down. If intercepted, they were meaningless. If followed, they could determine who lived and who disappeared. The instruction this time was unambiguous: do not act. For weeks, Allied planners had been tracking German rail movements across northern France. Signals intelligence suggested a major redeployment of freight capacity, locomotives being shifted, rolling stock consolidated, guards reassigned. The network was being reorganized, and London wanted clarity before disruption. Sabotage now, they believed, would trigger a security lockdown. Rail lines would be closed, yes, but they would also be repaired quickly. Patrols would be increased. Informants activated. The resistance networks, painstakingly built over months, could be compromised in a single sweep. Waiting, however, was not easy for the man receiving the message. He was not a soldier in uniform. He had no rank to protect him. He was a trained saboteur operating under the authority of the Special Operations Executive, inserted into occupied France with forged papers and a false name that changed depending on the checkpoint. Before the war, he had been an engineer. He understood steel, load limits, stress fractures, and failure points. That knowledge had made him valuable. It had also made him impatient. From his hiding place near the rail junction, he could see the evidence every night. Trains running heavier than before, longer consists, more fuel wagons, more flat cars carrying armored vehicles covered in tarpaulins. German traffic was not slowing, it was accelerating. To him, the delay felt dangerous. The orders, however, were rooted in fear of collapse. Resistance networks in 1942 were fragile ecosystems. Couriers relied on safe houses that could vanish overnight. Wireless operators transmitted under constant threat of direction-finding units. One careless act could unravel dozens of lives. London's planners knew this. They had already seen networks destroyed by premature action. In some regions, entire circuits had been eliminated after a single unauthorized operation drew attention. That was the logic behind restraint. But logic looked different under occupation. The saboteur had watched forced laborers drag from rail cars under guard. He had seen wounded soldiers shipped east and empty cars return west filled with coal and ammunition. The rail line he studied was not abstract infrastructure. It was the spine of the occupation. And he was not alone in thinking this way. Within resistance circles, frustration was growing. Orders from abroad sometimes felt disconnected from reality on the ground. Agents trained for demolition found themselves waiting endlessly, while opportunities passed within arm's reach. The man understood the risk. He had been trained to. He knew the German doctrine of reprisals. He knew that acting without authorization could cost others their lives. But he also knew something else: timing. Rail sabotage was most effective when traffic was dense and predictable. Winter had slowed repairs. Cold temperatures made steel brittle. A derailment now would not be cleared in hours. It could take days. He did not inform his network. He did not transmit a request for reconsideration. Those channels were too exposed, too slow. Instead, he prepared alone. The explosives were already cached. Plastic charges measured precisely for rail steel. Not destruction for spectacle, but for maximum disruption. He selected a curve in a line where speed and weight would work against the train itself. The order had been to wait. The decision he made was to act. And once that decision was made, every angle of the operation, human, tactical, technological, and moral, began to close in around him. Sabotage, when stripped of its code names and planning memoranda, was a solitary act. The man kneeling beside the rail carried no sense of heroism with him. There would be no witnesses to record courage, no comrades to share responsibility. If the charge detonated as intended, the success would belong to no one. If it failed, the blame would rest entirely on him. Isolation was not accidental. Resistance doctrine emphasized compartmentalization. Operatives were taught to know as little as possible about each other. It protected the network, but it also meant that at moments like this, decisions were made without counsel. Under occupation, time distorted judgment. Days were spent waiting, watching, listening. Action became a release from inertia. For some, restraint felt like complicity. The saboteur's conviction was not reckless. It was shaped by routine exposure to the machinery of war. He had seen schedules posted and altered. He had counted wagons. He had noted changes in guard behavior. This was not impulse. It was accumulated certainty. He believed delay favored the occupier. Rail sabotage was not about spectacle. It was about geometry, weight, and momentum. Explosives were placed where steel was already under stress, on curves, near switches, or at points where rails met different grades. A perfectly cut charge could crack a rail just enough to cause failure under load, without leaving obvious signs beforehand. Derailment multiplied damage. A single broken rail could overturn dozens of cars. Clearing the wreck required cranes, replacement track, and hours of uninterrupted work, luxuries the German rail system could not always afford in winter. The man's choice of location reflected training, not emotion. He selected a curve that forced freight trains to slow, increasing downward pressure. The colder the steel, the more brittle it became. This was calculated interference, not destruction for its own sake. The tools of sabotage were deliberately simple. Plastic explosive, detonators, timing pencils. No complex mechanisms that could fail under stress. SOE manuals emphasized reliability over ingenuity. Every charge had to work in mud, snow, and darkness. The saboteur used a delay, fuse calibrated to minutes, not seconds. Enough time to withdraw beyond the blast radius. Not enough to allow discovery. Timing pencils, chemical fuses that corroded a wire at a predictable rate, were favored because they required no batteries and left no electronic trace. This technology made lone action possible. It also made it dangerous. There was no abort once the fuse was engaged. When the saboteur set the charge, the physics were already committed to motion. Steel, speed, and gravity would do the rest. And yet, beyond the technical precision lay forces no explosive could control. Command decisions, enemy reactions, and moral consequences that would only reveal themselves after the blast. From London, the war was measured in maps and timetables. By early 1942, Allied planners were coordinating sabotage with long-term strategy. Rail disruption was no longer an end in itself. It was a tool to be used at specific moments, before offensives, during troop movements, or in support of larger operations yet to come. Unauthorized action threatened that balance. A single premature attack could alert German security services to an entire region. Direction-finding vans would sweep the countryside. Informants would be paid. Random inspections would become systematic. Resistance leaders understood this pattern all too well. Commanders were not blind to suffering. They feared multiplying it. The order to wait was not cowardice. It was an attempt to preserve networks for a moment when their impact would be decisive rather than symbolic. German rail doctrine emphasized speed and throughput over redundancy. Lines were heavily used, often beyond their intended capacity. Maintenance schedules were compressed. Guards were assigned unevenly, focused on stations rather than isolated stretches of track. This created vulnerabilities. The Germans relied on rapid repair units, engineers trained to clear wrecks quickly. But winter strained these units. Frozen ground slowed replacement. Snow limited visibility. A derailment in a remote area could immobilize traffic for days. German intelligence reports from the period repeatedly warned that small, localized acts caused disproportionate disruption. Sabotage did not need to be frequent. It needed to be well-timed. The saboteur acted without authorization, but not without awareness. He understood that consequences would not fall evenly. Civilians near the line could face reprisals. Fellow operatives might be arrested despite having no involvement. Moral clarity dissolved under occupation. Yet restraint carried its own weight. Watching trains roll east unchallenged meant accepting the suffering they enabled elsewhere. For some, inaction felt like participation. This tension between obedience and responsibility was never resolved by doctrine. It was left to individuals in moments where time, fear, and conviction converged. When the saboteur stepped away from the track, the fuse burning unseen beneath the rail, leadership theory, enemy doctrine, and moral calculation all gave way to physics. The turning point was now inevitable. The night did not react. There was no immediate sound after the saboteur withdrew into the tree line. No alarm, no voices. The rail lay silent beneath a thin crust of frost, unchanged to any passing glance. The charge rested beneath the outer rail, its timing pencil already dissolving, unseen and irreversible. Minutes passed. Freight schedules in occupied France rarely ran on time, but this one did. Shortly after midnight, the low vibration reached the ground first, a distant tremor that traveled through frozen soil before sound followed. Steel wheels announced themselves long before the train appeared. The locomotive emerged around the curve at reduced speed, exactly as anticipated. It was hauling heavy freight, fuel tankers, and covered wagons, the kind that strained axles and rails even in ideal conditions. A guard wagon rode near the rear, its occupants unaware of what lay ahead. The saboteur did not watch. He had been trained not to. Once the charge was set, observation served no purpose and increased risk. Instead, he counted silently, tracking the minutes by instinct rather than sound. The detonation was not loud. Not at first. It was a sharp metallic crack, followed by a deeper, grinding roar as steel failed under momentum. The outer rail fractured. The locomotive lurched. Its leading wheels jumped the track, pulling the rest of the train with it. Wagons collided in sequence. Fuel tanks ruptured. Timber frames splintered. One car jackknifed into the embankment, blocking the line completely. Another overturned into the snow, spilling its cargo in a tangle of metal and canvas. The noise carried for kilometers. Within seconds, the forest was alive with echoes, steam venting, metal shrieking, men shouting in confusion and pain. Emergency brakes screamed as they locked too late. The locomotive lay on its side, boiler hissing, its crew trapped inside the cab. The saboteur was already moving away. He followed a pre-planned route through brush and frozen ditches, increasing distance with each step. He did not know the full extent of the damage. He did not need to. A derailment of this scale could not be hidden, repaired quietly, or ignored. Behind him, the German response began. Flares went up along the line. Guards fired into the darkness, not at targets, but at fear itself. Whistles sounded from distant posts. Within minutes, the nearest garrison was alerted. By dawn, engineers would arrive. Investigators would follow. Questions would be asked, first about the track, then about the people living nearby. For now, the Saboteur vanished into the night, carrying nothing that connected him to the blast except the knowledge that the war had just shifted, if only slightly. But the true turning point was not the explosion itself. It was what came next. By first light, the scale of the derailment was unmistakable. The train lay broken across the line, its wagons scattered like debris from a storm. 2 fuel tankers had ruptured completely, their contents seeping into the snow and freezing in dark, irregular pools. The track was twisted beyond immediate repair. Sleepers were shattered. The rail bed itself had collapsed under the weight of the wreck. German railway engineers arrived within hours, but progress was slow. Cranes could not reach the site easily. Replacement rails had to be brought in from elsewhere, diverting resources already under strain. Security units established a perimeter, pushing civilians back while patrols swept the surrounding countryside. The response was methodical and unforgiving. Local inhabitants were questioned repeatedly. Identity papers were checked and rechecked. Several men were detained for further interrogation, not because evidence existed, but because examples were required. Notices were posted warning of severe penalties for further sabotage. Within German command channels, the incident was logged as deliberate and professional. The placement of the charge, the choice of curve, and the timing all pointed to trained involvement rather than spontaneous resistance. That assessment triggered consequences beyond the wreck site. Rail security across the region was intensified. Guards were reassigned from other duties. Night patrols increased. Repair crews were escorted. What had been a vulnerability was now under scrutiny. In London, the news arrived days later. Encoded reports filtered through resistance contacts, describing the derailment in cautious terms. The damage was confirmed. The line was out of service longer than expected. Freight schedules were disrupted, forcing rerouting and delays that rippled outward. But so did concern. The operation had not been authorized. No signal had preceded it. For planners who had ordered restraint, the sabotage was both proof of effectiveness and a warning. The very success of the action threatened to expose networks they were trying to protect. For the saboteur himself, the consequences were immediate and personal. Safe houses became uncertain. Movement grew dangerous. Increased patrols narrowed his options. He could not claim credit, nor could he explain his decision without endangering others. His act existed only in fragments of reports and in the altered behavior of the occupiers. The derailment delayed German logistics. That much was undeniable, but it also accelerated countermeasures that would claim lives far from the rail line itself. This was the paradox of lone action in occupied Europe. A single decision could disrupt an empire's machinery, and at the same time tighten its grip on those living beneath it. Victory and cost were no longer separate outcomes. They arrived together, inseparable. And as the smoke cleared and the rails were eventually replaced, the war moved forward carrying both the damage inflicted and the price paid. Those prices would only become fully visible in the days and weeks that followed. The rail line reopened days later, but it did not return to normal. German transport authorities recorded the derailment as a significant disruption. Rolling stock was lost. Fuel shipments were delayed. Units awaiting resupply were forced to ration or reroute through already congested lines. In isolation, the damage was manageable. In combination with similar acts across occupied Europe, it compounded an existing crisis. By early 1943, German internal reports increasingly described rail sabotage as a strategic threat rather than a nuisance. Derailments did not need to halt the system permanently. They only needed to introduce uncertainty, misconnections, delayed formations, incomplete deliveries. The derailment achieved that. But the occupation's response was immediate and severe. Security forces imposed collective penalties along the corridor. Curfews were tightened. Travel restrictions expanded. Several civilians detained during the initial sweeps were transferred to regional prisons. Their fates, like many under occupation, were rarely documented in detail. For resistance networks, the incident forced difficult recalculations. Cells operating nearby went silent. Wireless transmissions were suspended. Couriers avoided routes they had used for months. Safe houses were abandoned without warning. The absence of arrests among known operatives suggested that compartmentalization had worked, but also meant the saboteur's action had brought danger without clarity. In London, assessments were cautious. The derailment was logged as effective but ill-timed. Planners acknowledged the tangible disruption while reiterating the need for coordination. The fear was not that sabotage failed, but that success outside command control could undermine broader campaigns yet to come. This tension shaped Allied policy going forward. Sabotage would continue, but increasingly it would be synchronized with major operations, landings, offensives, and deception plans. Random acts, however effective, were seen as strategically inefficient when weighed against long-term objectives. For the saboteur, there was no official judgment. He remained a ghost within the records, an unnamed operative whose action appeared in reports stripped of motive or context. His decision was neither praised nor condemned in writing. It simply existed as a fact, absorbed into the machinery of war. Yet consequences do not end with reports. They unfold quietly, in altered routines, increased fear, and the tightening of control that follows disruption. And in that tightening, the true cost of acting alone under occupation became clearer with each passing day. As weeks passed, the region settled into a new rhythm shaped by suspicion. German patrols became a constant presence along the rail corridor. Observation posts appeared at intervals where none had existed before. Civilian laborers assigned to maintenance work were escorted and monitored. Even minor faults in the line now triggered full inspections. The resistance adapted, but at a cost. Networks avoided rail sabotage in the area entirely, shifting focus to intelligence gathering and minor acts that drew less attention. The derailment had proven what was possible, but it had also demonstrated the consequences of visibility. For the saboteur, survival required disappearance. He moved between safe houses less frequently, choosing longer periods of isolation over exposure. Communication with handlers became sporadic. Each transmission carried greater risk now that German direction-finding units were actively searching for unauthorized signals. There is no definitive record of his fate. Some operatives who acted independently in this period were eventually arrested. Others crossed into neutral territory or were exfiltrated months later. A few continued working under new identities, their earlier actions buried beneath layers of secrecy. What remains certain is that his decision altered behavior on both sides. German command treated the incident as evidence that trained saboteurs were operating beyond controlled networks. Allied planners, in turn, tightened command discipline, emphasizing authorization and synchronization. Individual initiative was not eliminated, but it was constrained. Post-war analyses of resistance effectiveness often highlight this tension. Successful sabotage depended on initiative, yet uncoordinated action risked collapse. The derailment became one of many unnamed incidents illustrating that balance. Numbers tell only part of the story. A delayed shipment, a repaired rail, a logged incident in an archive. These facts appear clean and contained. The lived experience was not. It was shaped by fear, uncertainty, and the knowledge that unseen decisions could bring sudden change. By the time Allied forces returned to the continent in force, rail sabotage would play a decisive, coordinated role in crippling German response. Those later successes were built on lessons learned in moments like this, when one man acted alone, and the consequences radiated outward in ways no order could fully predict. And with that understanding, the story turns away from action and toward meaning. War is often measured in movements of armies, shifts of territory, or the rise and fall of empires. Yet, sometimes it is a single decision, made in silence and cold, beneath a winter sky, that ripples farther than strategy ever could. The Saboteur's act was both simple and profound. He followed instinct over instruction, timing over hesitation, and the tangible logic of physics over abstract orders. In that moment, the machinery of war collided with human judgment. A train derailed, plans shifted, lives were imperiled, and yet the war moved on, shaped but not defined by his choice. His story illuminates a paradox that persists in all conflicts. Individual initiative can be decisive, but it carries a weight that no metal can quantify. Success may disrupt an enemy, but it may also imperil allies, civilians, or the very networks meant to support it. History remembers results, rarely the deliberation or restraint that preceded them. And perhaps that is the lesson. In war, as in life, action without authority is both power and peril. It is a reminder that human agency, frail, isolated, courageous, flawed, intersects with the grand sweep of events in ways both unforeseen and unavoidable. In the end, the rails were repaired. Freight schedules resumed. But the moment remains, a frozen instant in winter, when one man's choice reshaped the flow of conflict, if only for a night. It is a story of precision and risk, of obedience and defiance, of consequence and reflection. And in that balance, it captures the essence of what it meant to fight, survive, and act alone in a world at war.